to our ABE, Language Arts, Reading and Writing for Adults. So today, I think I've got a rather interesting topic that I think you'll enjoy. To my class, I did get a question just before I left to come here today, and I just want to answer Mike's question. We were in class last week, and we were looking at two different approaches to the use of TikTok. One was for using an online site, TikTok, where one person was advocating for it to be used in a classroom as some sort of a learning tool, where students could work together and be graded on their TikTok video. The other side of the argument was saying, oh no, don't do it. TikTok is being investigated and it's addictive, and it's and one of the reasons that it also said it's the fun that students and adults alike have outside of a classroom, so don't spoil it, that sort of thing. And the assignment was for you to read both sides and then pick one side and write your argument using the examples that one of the essays is using. So, but the other possibility is, if you don't think TikTok should be used at all, you can certainly write your own argument, Mike, and you can say, I don't think anybody should be using TikTok, and this is why. So, but you just have to pick one side. You can't say, well, there's equal benefits to it that are expressed by both articles. That makes sense, but for the testing that you're looking for on HiSET, the writing makes you pick one side or the other. So I hope that answers your question. But that's for the writing for our ABE class. So today what I want to do is I want to make you aware that November is Native American Indian Heritage Month. And this is to celebrate the many Americans that we have who are of the Native American Indian race. And I think some of the information that I have today will surprise you, and answer some of the questions that you may or may not have about this topic. I first got very interested in Native Americans back in 1994 or 5. I had a class at MCLA with Randy Hansis. It was a history class. And I was writing my final senior thesis, and I wanted to know why the different tribes that were here in America chose either to fight on the British side or on the colonist side during the American Revolution. And I actually got a chance to use my PC computer that I had purchased for home and was on America Online, AOL, first chat site that you had. And I talked with Indians in the Lakota tribes that had been transported out west. And I found out a lot about what to do and what not to do, because my first problem was, what do you call these tribes of different people who were here before us? Nowadays, it's common to use a word like indigenous. It's a big, long word, indigenous, and it means the people that were born on the land. So in essence, the big majority of us, including myself, I was born here, but my ancestors were not. They were from Europe and in Italy and France and places like that. But the native people who were born here are indigenous people. But according to legality, Native Americans is the term that's used now for this race of people. When you're using the hand thing, black, brown, white, yellow, red, the Native Americans are considered the red race. So the advice I got back in 1995, though, is don't just go with the easy way out. Find out what tribe the person's a part of. So today what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you a few images that explain basically the fact that Native people, there were thousands and thousands of them now. And at this point, according to the 2010 census, there are approximately 5 million to 6 million Native Americans that live in the United States total, which is 1.6% of the entire population. And some of them are living on reservations, some of them are in different states. There's actually a lot of them that live in Alaska. So let me just break that down before I get to my maps. Of the 574 sovereign tribal nations, and the word sovereign means they are recognized by the United States government, and they are a part of their own country in a way, in their own nation, which is called Indian country. And it is classified as such because where they are, if they have, and you know, you've been to some of their land and their ownings and their businesses. If you've gone to Foxwood or the Mohegan Sun in Connecticut, that property is owned by the Wampanoags, and they don't pay taxes on their winnings. Think about that. So the thing is that of the 574 different sovereign tribes, 229 of them are located in the state of Alaska. And you know Alaska is one of our 50 states, so they are considered Americans, but they are also part of Indian country. So that it's almost like they have dual citizenship. In their own land-held communities, they have their own police, they have their own mayor, if that's what they're called. They have their own government. If someone commits a crime in their community, their own courts take care of it, because we have to get past the idea that these are people that they look just like you and me. You would not know them. Perhaps if you went to these different states, you would not know who the Native people are or who weren't. But the other fact that I found, now that I'm throwing all these statistics at you, is because of where all the Native people live in the United States, if they own property where the land is, say they're living in their own home, maybe on an acre of land and whatnot, if you put all that property together and looked at it in mass, it would provide the fourth largest state of the Union, the state of Indian country. And if you can just imagine this. So there's a lot of people who have interests that are truly Native American interests. The main thing that I found that is so important to Native tribes from the beginning of the time of the white man, or the invaders in a way. Some people like to call white people the invaders, but it was the French, the Spanish, British at the beginning, is that they want self-government. They do not want to be told how to take care of the land. They do not want, they want the rights that we see in our Constitution. And you'll find that some tribes actually helped write our Constitution because they had their own type of Constitution. So what I'd like to start with is my first map, and I'll meet you at the whiteboard, and we'll go down through where these tribes lived. So on this map, this is called a cultural map. It just is basically broken down as to like climate regions. Up here in the light green is the subarctic, which includes Alaska. So you would see what we consider Eskimos are considered native people. And it comes down through Canada. Up here is the Arctic. And then more common to us is the Northeast, which is Maine over here, going through the Great Lakes. That's called the Northeast. That's where those tribes were. Down below is the Southeast, Southwest, the Plains Indians, the Great Basin Indians. California is separate unto itself. The Plateau and the Northwest Coast. So when you think about that, this is like before the United States was created, and it's just, you notice there's no fences, there's no boundaries. Most of the tribes who were friendly agreed that they would hunt wherever the game led them, and then they would travel. So this is America when it was purely native people. When we get a little further ahead in time, this is a map of just the Northeast. It's black and white, but I don't know if I can show it to you. But we have New York over here. This is the Huron tribe, and then you have Lake Erie down here, and this is New York State. If you can see, this is the Hudson River coming up. Maybe you can't, but this is the Hudson River coming up through here, Champlain, up to Quebec. This map I've always liked because right here in North Adams, most of us know about Fort Massachusetts. And Fort Massachusetts is over on the way to Williamstown. Well, it was where the Friendly was, and now there's the Central City and things like that. But the fort was over there near where the old Friendly's was. And in 1747, it was attacked by the French and the Abenaki tribe that came down from Vermont, actually, out of Canada. And when they took captives back up here to Quebec, they traveled up along Champlain, and they camped out. And a very unusual thing happened. There were some Huron Indians that were with the French and the Abenaki, and they insisted that they be given some captives to travel back to Quebec with, because each prisoner that was brought back to Quebec, there was money that was going to be given for each of those captives. The Hurons, however, had to travel left over to their encampment over on Lake Huron, and for some reason they veered off, and then they went to Quebec. And there's whole stories about that particular case. What is remarkable is that the women and children and men who were with that group of Indians, they actually survived their being prisoners when they got to Quebec, because the first group caught cholera and they all died because the prison was infected. The ones that came late, actually after the war, were returned back to this area and lived out their lives here. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. A lot of warfare all the time, but the Five Nations are the New York tribes. They're the ones that we call the Mohawks. And the Mohawks, it wasn't that great in Indian land either, because the Mohawks were like the godfathers. They demanded tribute from the other tribes, and they would attack, and they would steal and rob and do things like that. So there's a lot of history. All the tribes are not the same, and they all have their own different things that they're looking for. Here's a better map, I think, that shows you the breakdown in just the Northeast tribes. Thank you. That's a little better to see. So when I mentioned Foxwood and the Mohegan Sun, this is down in Connecticut, and those are the Wampanoag. You have the Abenaki that I mentioned that were up in Vermont and into Maine. Abenaki, they're the ones that attacked Fort Mass. And you also have the Huron tribe is right here. You have the Algonquin, but over here in New York State, there are the 5 nations: Mohegan, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and those were a federation. And they were sort of led by the Iroquois right here. The Iroquois and these tribes in New York got together and actually said, let's not fight. We've got to form together and stop fighting, and we can be a nation that is one nation where we all have the same interests and the same needs. Let's get together. And they've built the Iroquois Confederacy, and some of their agreed upon principles became something that the founders of our American nation put together when they first decided on what should go into the Constitution. So they looked at their Constitution, I guess I'd call it. When you go down more away from our New England states, you get down here and you can see that their Powhatan tribe is down here, the Tuscarora, as you come down the coast. And these are some of the tribes, the Delaware, and some Shawnee are going more toward the center of the United States. So again, that's just the northeastern tribes. And as I showed you the first map, there's many, many tribes all over what we now call the United States of America. I'm showing you this as an example of this is kind of our northeast climate. There's a lot of hardwoods and firs. There's a lot of lumber up here. We have mountains, we have streams, a lot of fishing, a lot of game. So this area right here was really a wonderful place if you were a hunting expedition from, say, over on the other side of the mountain. Deer were here, all sorts of game. And the Indians in the Northeast came over the mountain here. We do believe that our Mount Greylock actually, in some of the old books written about the area, someone compares Greylock to a man that is bald on top with clouds around the bottom near his ears, that sort of thing, and that's why it's called, he's got Greylock. At the top is the top of the mountain, or the top of a bald man's head. But I've seen a lot of information that comes from the different tribes, and there was a very revered Abenaki chief called Greylock, and I like to think it's him. There was a mudslide around here a few years back, and it really did look like an Indian, a Northeast Indian on the end of Mount Greylock, which mountains are very special to tribes. That's usually where, if they're in the habit of burying their dead, not all Indians burn them on piers like in the plains. Most Indians around here buried their dead, and they would have felt that Mount Greylock, the highest mountain, would have been a sacred place. So I tend to believe that Greylock was named after an Indian. The way that the tribes around here lived were The Iroquois lived in what they called longhouses, where a group of families would live together. They would build this during the warmer summer months, and then they would, let me show you the inside one too. It's right here. And they would share spaces. This would be what it looked like inside of a longhouse. There's a really nice reproduction of one over in the Albany Museum. If you ever go over there, it's really very interesting to see. They've got skins drying, and there's a woman here. People would sleep sort of on a bunk bed situation, but there's places for everybody to be able to eat and stay warm in the winter and dry their herbs and live together in a communal kind of way. Those are the longhouses. This represents a village where Chief Powhatan, down in this almost to the southeast Indian tribes, you would see not just one longhouse, but if it was a big tribe, there would be a variety of longhouses, probably children of children and, you know, of parents and things like that. And these kind of Indians, they didn't just hunt, they farmed. So and they would have celebrations, and they would, they actually ended up being quite the farmers. And they did raise corn and things like that. So the way they lived changes with every tribe also. Different traditions are also special to different tribes. This is what is called a calumet, or what we would call a peace pipe. And for northeastern Indians, the smoking of a peace pipe that everyone passed around was quite common, where on special occasions everyone would form in a circle. Circle is just as important as what we consider when you have a ring. It's unbroken, and it shows community and faithfulness to a group. And so this is an example of an early drawing of how those peace pipe calumet ceremonies were held in the Northeast. Many of the tribes had some sort of wampum. That was a special belt. It looks like a belt, but it's their money. So they would, I went to a demonstration of wampum making a few years back, and the wampum they were making came from clamshells that they pounded very carefully to get the shell off, so you were left with just the white and purple of the inside of a clamshell, and then they would have to drill very carefully to put holes in them, and then string the beads. And the main chief of the tribe would wear this and always have the wampum ready to buy, purchase blankets, things that they needed. So they are well adorned, yes, adorned. But what we think of as maybe jewelry is actually perhaps a wampum belt or a necklace or things like that would have been traded between tribes, and that was their way of commerce in some way. Along with the longhouse type of shelter, you also had the wickiup type, which is a rounded hut. Notice I'm not showing you any teepees because that type of shelter was not really made around New England. You'll see them up on the Mohawk Trail, but that was more the plains Indians who could take them down, and they would be able to put them on their horses and carry the poles on the horses, and it was a different shelter. This type is the type when they attacked Fort Massachusetts, they had small ones because they camped along Lake Champlain, and they would just set these up for the night. They sometimes they were made out of bark. This one looks more like a skin contraption, but it's they were smaller, that you could just, like a pop-up size, and they were wickiups. That's what they were called around here. The tribes in the Northeast also were really, really great bead makers. So when they made their moccasins and things, you'll find certain kinds of designs where they've made beads. They've also used deer skin and cloth, and very decorative, and they liked color, a lot of the tribes around here. This is Black Hawk, a Northeast Indian, and in this picture, they're showing what they call the roach hairstyle, and they would strap it to the top of their head. So when we often call it a mohawk when kids get their hair cut like that, one strip of hair, that sort of thing. But this was a lot of times feathers and things that were used sort of to show status in a tribe. And this was an 1838 painting of this Indian chieftain. I mentioned Powhatan, and this is his image that was also painted by a person coming through. And you can see it's not just, there are feathers, but he's got that feather kind of roach in the back, but he also uses scarves, he has earrings, he has a nose ring, and then there's the decorative necklace pieces that show that he's a wealthy chief. So these are some of the northeastern Indians back in the 1800s. But what I want to talk about now is what's going on with Native American Indians now. This is the month we're celebrating, but I told you how many of these Native people are still in the country. I'm going to show you this map, and I want to point out a couple of things, and then I want to show you a video clip of the president of the Native American people's Indian country. So let me show you this map first. This is a map of North America, and you can't probably, well, you can see it very well. Thank you for the close-up. So we've got Alaska up here, part of the United States. We've got Canada through here, and then we have the United States. You can see there's a lot of Native people up here. The darker the color, the more tribal citizens there are. And so again, Alaska's got from 25 to 90% of Alaska has Native peoples living there. When you get down to the United States, this state right here is Washington State. So according to our color coding, there are 5 to 10% tribes in Washington State. The president of the Native American people Indian country comes from Washington State. So if we could we show the clip about our president of the Indian country?
Good morning, my name is Fawn Sharp. I consider it my life's greatest honor to have this opportunity to share with you today. I thank the Creator for gathering us together for this historic dialogue between Indian country and the United States. On behalf of the 574 federally recognized tribal nations, dozens of state-recognized tribal nations, and millions of Native people across this country, I welcome the distinguished guests assembled here today and those watching around the globe to the 18th Annual State of Indian Nations Address. I stand before you today as a humble servant of all tribal nations, fulfilling my duty to share Indian country's story of perseverance and resurgence with the world, to convey with absolute clarity Indian country's expectations of the United States government, and to cast a light on the immense power and proven wisdom of tribal nations governing their own lands and affairs, solving difficult challenges, and forging brighter futures on their own terms. I embrace the enormity of this task, for I have been groomed for decades to carry it out by transformative leaders in whose footsteps I follow. Leaders like Beatrice Black, Elizabeth Cole, Tiny Kapoma, and Hazel Rosander, and Ramona Bennett, to name just a few. These matriarchs kindled a great fire in me to give my life in leadership to my Quinault people and all of Indian country. Just as important, they showed me the way, and for that I am forever grateful. I also draw great strength, as they did, from our Almighty Creator. The advice of my fellow tribal leaders, the spiritual nourishment and life lessons of canoe journeys, the inspiration, passion, and ingenuity of our brilliant Native youth, and the ancestral teachings of our elders. Their wisdom, encouragement, and guidance have prepared me to meet this moment. So why do we gather here today? The purpose of this annual address is to memorialize and affirm the enduring government-to-government relationship between tribal nations and the U.S. government. It provides our assessment of the current health of that relationship and how it must be strengthened. This hallowed discourse not only speaks to elected officials, political and judicial appointees, and staff of the federal government, nor is it limited to tribal leaders, employees, and citizens. It is meant for all Americans, especially those who have been disenfranchised and rendered hopeless by racial injustice, economic inequality, and the rapid decay of our American political system. They seek answers during these troubling times, and they need to look no further than tribal nations to find them. In that spirit, I stand before you today, supported by more than 600 tribal nations and governments across this land, to share with you this undeniable truth. The state of Indian nations is strong. Across this land, tribal nations are writing remarkable stories of cultural, social, political, and economic renewal. In the face of great obstacles, we relentlessly plow forward in our eternal quest to create futures of hope, opportunity, and cultural vibrancy for our youth and those generations yet to come. We do so by invoking and practicing the greatest indigenous core values of all, self-governance. The Creator gifted tribal nations with certain inalienable rights, among them the right to steward and draw nourishment from our traditional homelands, cultivate extraordinary potential of our youth, develop thriving economies that provide opportunity for all of our people, and manage our own affairs and control our own destinies. As my mentor, former Quinault leader, and NCI President Joe Delacruz so perfectly captured it, no right is more sacred to a nation, to a people, than the right to freely determine its social, economic, political, and cultural future without external interferences. The fullest expression of this right is when a nation freely governs itself. We Native peoples not only have the inherent right, but the sacred responsibility to live the way our Creator intended, speaking our indigenous languages, living our traditional core values, and imparting them to the next generations, practicing our life ways, conducting our ceremonies, and freely governing our lands and communities. Tribal nations are not nonprofit organizations. We are full-fledged, battle-tested governments guided by time-honored cultural principles and recognized as such in the Northwest Ordinance, the U.S. Constitution, and hundreds upon hundreds of treaties and Supreme Court precedents. However, many Americans, including many policymakers, still don't understand the unique status of tribal nations, our unique political status. They don't recognize the indisputable fact that we are genuine governments with the right and, more importantly, the ability to govern our own lands and communities. And to govern those in accordance with the values that make us who we are as Native peoples. But through mechanisms like this annual address, more and more Americans and others around the world are learning this truth, and in doing so are turning to Indian country for inspiration, direction, and most importantly, solutions to our common challenges in this great age of uncertainty. Acting with the next 7 generations in mind, our ancestors endured great hardships to forge our path to this day so that we would be able to be their answer to prayer for thriving cultures, healthy children, and robust communities. We must and we will be worthy of the great sacrifices they made to give us this chance to sustain not only our way of life, but our world for future generations. We will rise to this challenge for the next 7 generations by relying on the same indigenous governance principles, notably strategic vision, separation of powers, and checks and balances on the abuse of power that our ancestors have practiced for millennia to overcome the grave threats to tribal sovereignty, our freedom to be who we are, and our very existence as human inhabitants on this planet. However, tribal nations' ability to rise to this challenge is under a growing duress. The threats to tribal sovereignty and self-determination take many forms, and they come from every branch and every corner of federal and state governments. They stem from an ignorance or a hostility toward the unique political status of tribal nations as a vital part of the original American family of governments and the federal government's everlasting trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations. Yes, there have been some encouraging developments worth noting. For example, we recently saw the passage of the Esther Martinez Native American Language Program Reauthorization Act and the Futures Act, which permanently extends mandatory funding for tribal colleges, universities, and related academic institutions. Meanwhile, the proposed regulations updating the Community Reinvestment Act promise to expand access to capital to much-needed tribal governments, communities, and citizens. However, these are the exceptions to an increasingly alarming rule. Take the Violence Against Women Act. VAWA 2013 affirmed jurisdiction of tribal governments to prosecute non-Native offenders in domestic violence crimes on tribal lands. Many tribal nations now exercise that authority, providing justice for Native victims where none existed before. Their work has exposed critical gaps in the 2013 law that the new VAWA legislation can and should fix. Yet Congress is refusing to expand tribal authority to administer justice for victims of sexual violence, child abuse, stalking, and human trafficking, as well as law enforcement officers assaulted in the line of duty. Take the current administration's wanton interference with tribal nations' right to restore our traditional homelands, which has created an arbitrary system of haves and have-nots among tribal nations seeking to place land into trust. Take the mounting assaults on the Indian Child Welfare Act by special interest groups intent on stealing Native children from their families, communities, and cultures. ICWA has been hailed as the gold standard by child welfare experts, and its legal validity has been affirmed countless times over the past 4 decades. Yet, a recent federal court ruling ignored those facts, placing this vital law in real jeopardy. In addition to these existential threats, we have threats caused by federal inaction and indifference. Take the severe chronic underfunding of the federal government's trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations, powerfully illustrated in the recent Broken Promises report. This report is a troubling glimpse into the pervasive impacts that federal budget shortfalls have on the health and vibrancy of tribal communities. It comes 15 years after another congressional report came to the exact same conclusion, that the United States is failing to hold its end of the grand covenant it struck with tribal nations in exchange for hundreds of millions of acres of tribal lands and valuable resources they contain. Needless interruptions and delays in federal funding also pose a significant threat. The 2019 government shutdown, the longest in history, is the latest example of an incompetent federal budget process jeopardizing tribal nations' ability to provide vital services to our citizens, from law enforcement to healthcare to emergency response. And just once in the last 22 years has Congress passed a fiscal budget on time, an inexcusable sign of a broken system. In addition, tribal nations must compete with one another for federal grant programs, a gross violation of the federal government's trust and treaty responsibilities to us. Meanwhile, Congress left Indian country completely out of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, despite years of Hill advocacy by NCAI and our partners in promoting Indian country's tax reform priorities. Priorities that will clearly boost tribal efforts to build sustainable economies and grow local job opportunities. Congress has also neglected its responsibility by failing to pass legislation that reaffirms the inherent right of tribal governments to regulate labor, permanently reauthorize the remarkably effective Special Diabetes Program for Indians, reauthorizes the Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act to curb Indian country's severe housing shortages, and take long overdue steps to curtail the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic that is ravaging so many of our communities and families. But federal inaction and indifference is perhaps no more destructive than with the current failure of the administration and some in Congress to address the rapidly accelerating impacts of climate change, or even acknowledge that it exists. As Chief Seattle once said, "What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves." The damage human beings have done and continue to do to this planet disrupts every facet of tribal life, from our subsistence lifeways to our ceremonies to our continued stewardship of the natural world. My nation of Quinault is already feeling the brunt as ocean sea level rise are forcing us to permanently relocate our 2 main villages to higher ground. When it comes to climate change and sustaining humanity on this planet, we have no time left to lose, and yet our government is nowhere to be found. Finally, tribal nations face threats from an administration that appears committed to obstructing the express will of Congress. Take the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act. While ratified nearly 4 years ago, the administration has refused to implement key provisions, notably the creation of an Undersecretary for Indian Affairs to protect and advance tribal interests within the Department of Interior, and the establishment through a meaningful dialogue with Indian country of trust asset management plans. Equally disgraceful is the interagency MOA the administration developed to implement the new 477 Tribal Workforce Development Law. That law was specifically passed to expand this successful program and place self-determination squarely at the heart of Indian country workforce development. Yet the MOA was purposefully written to ignore the law by allowing federal agencies to veto individual programs that tribal nations have every right to include in their 477 plans, a dynamic the law was explicitly designed to stop. Despite these darkening storm clouds, tribal nations continue to shine brightly. We do so much with so little because our people count on us to find a way, no matter what. We devise innovative solutions to the greatest challenges facing our communities because that's what governments do.
Don't you just love her and her hat, right? But she's a very powerful president, and I may have said her organization, which represents Indian country, these 6 million American citizens that say they are Native people, is called the National Congress of American Indians, the NCAI. And they do, she's a lawyer. And I do want to explain a little bit about her hat. So if you can go to the whiteboard, she wears this hat when she goes to public functions. And I thought, what a strange hat. And I've never seen anything like that. But that's my assumption going wrong, because just because you're Native American, you're not always looking like our northeastern tribes. She's from the Quinault tribe, and they are very famous, actually, in American history. The Quinault tribe is who Lewis and Clark met up with their guide Sacagawea from another tribe, when they got to Washington State. Well, it's Washington State now, but out west, and no white person had ever been there before. And that tribe, her tribe, built cedar canoes. Let me just show you the picture that Lewis and Clark described in his diary when he got out there. There's cedar wood canoes, and he said they were the longest, strongest canoes he had ever encountered. And here's a woman with they're hand carved from a log of a cedar tree, and they were quite. But again, they lived on the West Coast. They were fishermen, and they could get out into the ocean to get the saltwater fish and things like that. You'll also notice that this is a woman standing by that canoe, and that she's wearing her tribal hat. So the woman, her name is Fawn Sharp, President Fawn Sharp, wears that traditional hat to promote her tribe and the tribes of that part of our country, the Northwest Coast tribes. And they are also basket makers. She's got a basket in her hand. But again, this is a real woman. That was her State of the Indian tribes last year on February 14th, 2020. Not last year, this year, February 14th, 2020. And she gives, the president of this Congress gives the State of the Indian Tribes address every year. And I just love her. I think she's a very powerful speaker. And before she became the president, she was a lawyer and was an advocate for Indian rights. So a lot of things are happening with the Native American people in the United States. When you listen to what they're advocating for, they're advocating for help with climate change. They're advocating for rights of women. There's a lot of trafficking going on with young Native women who are being kidnapped even around the Great Lakes out this way near our part of the country. And so keep your eye on what is really happening, because a lot of things that have happened to different minority groups now it's time that we saw the need for all lives mattering. And I just think that it's very important that we're aware of it. I'll leave you with one last thought, though. A lot of us, when we're in the house and can't go very far because of COVID, we often use movies that we watch, and I want you to be very aware about how Native people are depicted in movies, because I think so many of us grew up with, say, Westerns and things, and Native people are usually seen as like the noble savage, or they're wild and uncontrollable savages, and depictions of are stereotypes that are not always true. And again, those were in the past. Wouldn't you fight for your own land and your own home and your children and things yourself? You know, I mean, put yourself in their predicaments. But take a look at some of the movies that have had different depictions of Native Americans that were really different. I think the one that I always liked was Dances with Wolves. Think about that. That was with Kevin Costner. That one sort of gives the real truth to it. Think about, even if you're old enough, of the Lone Ranger and Tonto. I mean, they're always sidekicks, Native Americans, to the Lone Ranger, who was in a mask and didn't want anybody to know who he really was. A lot of shows on television, you had the F Troop and you know, different things like that. But really look and see, how are the Indians portrayed? Are they savages that go around killing everyone and scalping people and things like that? And question yourself, is it true, or is it a depiction where it's not accurate? And once we get past the inaccuracies about history, we can solve some of the problems and the unfair things that continue to go on. Most of the reservations, what she was talking about, President Sharp, was that for the most part, these Native people get along very well with state government. But the worst thing that happens is that the federal government tends to ignore them. So if you can do anything, or you can contribute to any causes that help these people, the children especially don't really get a great education on reservations, because there's just less money there than there is anywhere else. So thank you for joining me. Remember to celebrate Native American peoples' history this month, and see you next week.